Dear David Graeber, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your flexibility in coming here on such short notice and for being in this crowded place. I'm sure we'll make the best of it. As the president and publisher of Campus Verlag, I have the privilege of introducing to you our renowned author, David Graeber. We're grateful that David was able to make it to Frankfurt before speaking in Munich, Cologne, Berlin, and Leipzig. And we're delighted to be the German publisher of his latest book, Inside Occupy. The German edition is the first one to be published worldwide. The American edition won't be available until January of next year. And the German edition is the only one that includes a 24-page revolution guide with an exclusive preface by David Graeber, a map of all the Occupy camps and protests in Germany and around the world, and an interview with Eric Boone from Occupy Frankfurt. The anthropologist, anarchist, and political activist David Graeber is the man of the hour. Nobody else was there, both from the beginning and with a background, to describe, evaluate, and historically contextualize Occupy Wall Street. His theses in the book Inside Occupy are radical, his observations intelligent. He provides unique insights into the heart of the movement. We learn how everything started, why the protests went around the world so quickly, and why time is ripe for revolutionary action. Whoever wants to understand Occupy has to read this book. German media attention has already been spectacular, with a 4-page interview in the Spiegel and a prominent review in the Zeit, both this week. David Graeber was born in 1961 and is an American anarchist, anthropologist, and member of the Union Industrial Workers of the World. He was a professor of ethnology at Yale University until June 2007 and is a reader of ethnology at Goldsmiths College, University of London. He has written several books, among them Debt, the First 5,000 Years, in German, Schulden, die ersten 5,000 Jahre, which is also the topic of today's presentation. Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, in German, Frei von Herrschaft, and Revolution in Reverse, in German, Kampf dem Kamikaze-Kapitalismus. To sum up, let me say that David Graeber is one of our leading authors in a list that includes names like Paul Krugman, Robert Schiller, Jeremy Rifkin, Michael Hart, who will take part in a discussion with David at 7 o'clock this evening, I believe also here, Toni Negri, and Sarah Wagenknecht. We look forward to hearing what David Graeber has to say for himself in conversation with Christian Felber, the co-founder and co-speaker of Attack Austria. Christian is also an experimental dancer and the author of Gemeinwohlökonomie, in English, Economy in the Public Interest, and Retten wir den Euro, in English, Save the Euro. After this dialogue, we'll open the discussion for the floor. Should anyone be interested in buying David Graeber's books, you may do so outside or inside this room after the presentation. Let me point out that Inside Occupy only costs €14.99. I'm sure the author would be willing to sign copies, should you so wish. I'd like to thank our cooperation partners for making this event possible, Occupy Frankfurt, and particularly Eric Boone, David's other German publisher, Klett-Cotta, who organized the author's tour, and the person who made this room available in such short notice. I'm sorry I don't know her name at the moment, but I'd like to thank her anyway. And now I ask you to heartily welcome David Graeber, who will lead us on an eye-opening journey inside Occupy and the world of debt, as well as our moderator, Christian Felber, who now has the microphone. Thank you.
Ja, hallo allerseits. Ich beginne auf Deutsch und setze dann auf Englisch fort. Ich komme gerade aus Mannheim. Dort ist die gesamte Innenstadt okkupiert. Langsam. Alles voller Zelte, überall K-Gruppen, aber keine Polizei. Vielleicht, weil die Katholiken sich nicht mit den Banken anlegen. In Frankfurt wurde eine Festung errichtet. Wir sehen die Frankfurter Festung, um die Schuldner zu schützen. Die Schuldner werden geschützt, wenn sie mächtig sind, sagt auch David. Wenn sie klein sind, kommen sie ins Gefängnis. Wenn sie mächtig sind, sind sie zu groß, um ins Gefängnis zu kommen. Und das heißt dann auf Englisch, too big to jail. Warum werden die Schuldentürme nicht zu Schuldtürmen? Ja, why the towers of debt don't become and convert into debt prisons. This is a German wordplay. I change to English in a second. Just a last quotation in German. Anscheinend ist es wirklich so, dass, wenn es ums Eingemachte geht, also um die Finanzmärkte, alle rechtsstaatlichen Masken fallen gelassen werden. Das hat Konstantin Wecker gestern gesagt. Meines Wissens nach sind derzeit 500 Personen im polizeilichen Gewahrsam. Wir wissen es, weiß es jemand genau? Ja. Ja, also die Informationen sind unterschiedlich. Die Meinungsfreiheit wird abgeschafft, die freie Bildung bekommt Nachrang, die freie Kultur. Auch das Schauspielhaus hat sich in letzter Sekunde entschieden, doch nicht als Veranstaltungsort zur Verfügung zu stehen. Es war die Entscheidung des Schauspielhauses und nicht der Polizei. Also auch die freie Kultur. Da könnte doch jetzt jemand das Wort ergreifen, der von Freiheit viel versteht in diesem Land. Sie kennen dieses Büchlein. Ihr kennt dieses Büchlein. Wo ist eigentlich Joachim Gauck?
Katholikentag.
Vielleicht ist er am Katholikentag im Mannheim. Das weiß ich nicht. Aber wenn Joachim Gauck schon nicht zu uns spricht, dann soll vielleicht, bevor we go into the interview, let Eric from the Occupy movement say some words to you. Is Eric here? Yeah.
Well, look around you. You are a threat of public interest to the public. Normally, we would look out the window, see the ECB and the Euro sign, but we cannot because we are so dangerous. We are the revolution force of this nation right now, and we are such a big danger that policemen, 3 times of our number, are here in Frankfurt from all over Germany, from the north of Rostock to the south of Munich. They are here, and if we get enough people to do this thing we're doing here in several cities in Germany, they have not enough policemen to stop us. You cannot rule when the people you're ruling don't follow. And we won't follow if we are not, if we will not get our right to say what we want to meet where we want to, and to do what we like to, when we like to. And that's the point. We make a stand against repression, and we make a stand right now here. I know the German media isn't show any hot stuff, what happens here, because we are not violent. They have not the pictures they want to, would like to, but Well, the media in Europe, in Russia, in Iran, they are looking at us. So the whole world is watching us right now here in Frankfurt, so-called Bankfurt, and we will make trouble to them, because the city of Frankfurt is not the city of banks, it's the city of bank critics. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm sorry, die Veranstaltung wird jetzt auf Englisch stattfinden.
Wenn jemand kein Englisch versteht, bitte setzt euch neben jemanden, der euch einfach direkt übersetzt. Weil, wenn wir das direkt übersetzen würden ins Deutsche, würde die Veranstaltung ungefähr 3 Stunden dauern. Dementsprechend, bitte sucht euch einen einzelnen Übersetzer. Es gibt genug Leute hier, die Englisch verstehen und die bereit sind, das zu tun. Sprecht sie einfach an. Danke.
Vielleicht zeigen einfach diejenigen, die kein Englisch verstehen, auf, damit dann Personen, die Englisch und Deutsch verstehen, übersetzen können. Also hier ist Hilfe benötigt. Wird sonst noch wo Hilfe benötigt? Okay, also bitte Helfende, eilen Sie in diese Übersetzungszone. Gut, der Raum ist zu klein für alle, die bei uns sein wollen. The room is too small for all those who want to join us. Many more. So, I don't have the technical information if you could change outside. I don't have the information. Yeah, the micro check, I think. The info is that the microphone is not loud enough if you go outside. So maybe we stay inside and we change the audience from time to time. I don't understand the proposal.
They're suggesting using the people's microphone.
Yes.
Human mic. All styrofoams.
That's like
Yeah, okay, the people's microphone. But it's a very... Could you use the people's microphone? Das demokratische Mikrofon. Also... I think there is no Hello, David.
Hello.
Finally again. One of your main theses in the book is that there has been hardly any revolution without being the cause of the revolution a debt situation. On the one hand, is this true? And on the other hand, is this the possible beginning of a big revolution that's original cause is debt?
Can people hear me? Yeah. Oh, that's much better. Okay. First of all, let me. Let me apologize. What's going on? Morgan.
David has the words.
Yes. We're good? Okay. Let me apologize, first of all, for having to speak in English. Actually, my grandfather grew up speaking German, and my father learned German when he was fighting in the international brigades in Spain, but I never did. It's German name. Well, the question was, is this a debt revolution? I think that what we have been seeing over the last year has been the beginnings of a world revolutionary upheaval. I called the great world historian Emanuel Wallerstein, who's talked about a series of world revolutions, starting with the French Revolution, World Revolution of 1848, the World Revolution of 1917, World Revolution of 1968, and I said, so are we talking World Revolution of 2011? And he said yes. But it's frequently we don't talk about how much the Arab revolutions were also about debt. The Egyptian revolution in particular. It was one reason that the army took one side and the police took the other, is because the police had become the debt enforcers for Egyptian capitalism, which was switching from a sort of old state model, which the army supported, to development, to microcredit. And the police were essentially the people who came to break your legs if you couldn't pay. It's significant, for example, most people don't know this, that the Saudi reaction to the Arab Spring was, first of all, to massively increase security spending, but at the same time, they canceled debts. There was a debt cancellation across Saudi Arabia. They made sure that nobody really knew this happened. But it shows that they were very, very concerned about the issue.
So if this is the beginning of a worldwide revolution, maybe a debt revolution, from an historical point of view, because you have now experience over 5,000 years, then you could have the security or the authority to say what could be the possible outcome of this revolution, if it's the beginning of a revolution.
Well, I'm an optimist, so I think that we have the potential for the kind of global transformation that really only happens maybe every 500 years. If you think, the terms that I set out in the book have to do with forms of money. And if you look at forms of money, I quickly realized that the terms that we're thinking in are not taking history into account. We think as if virtual money, the form of money that we have now, credit money, sometimes it's called fiat money, but credit money is a better term for it, is a new thing. Somehow made possible by computers. It's in fact, rather than being some kind of brave new financial world, what we are seeing is the return to the original form of money. Money for thousands of years, through most of human history, has been credit money. Most transactions in world history have been credit transactions. And there are periods of history dominated by virtual money, and periods of history where people assume that money is really a physical thing, that it's a commodity, and people use cash in everyday transactions. And it shifts back and forth over human history. So what's happened since, usually people take the date 1971, the date when Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, as being the key transitional point. Rapidly thereafter, we saw the increasing financialization of capitalism. We saw the use of credit cards replacing cash in everyday transactions, a whole series of different related changes. But rather than being something very new, in many ways it's a return to something very old. But there is one key difference. Throughout human history, when we've had virtual money, it means that people understand that money isn't a thing. It's not something like petroleum, which you can run out of. It's a social relation. It's essentially a promise. Money is a promise that we make to one another, a circulating IOU. Now, once you understand that, it becomes clear that there has to be a social process of control over that to make sure that the whole thing doesn't fly out of hand. In every period where money takes this form, there is such a mechanism. It usually takes the form of some overarching, often religious mechanism. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, there was periodic debt cancellation. You would have debt crises whereby more and more people would fall into debt to wealthy money lenders. People would sell their flocks, their fields. Eventually family members or even themselves would be sold into debt peonage. And kings, fearing social breakdown, would declare a clean slate. All debts would be canceled. In fact, the very first word for human freedom, which we have recorded in any human language, is the Sumerian word amargi, which literally means return to mother. It's the word for debt freedom, debt cancellation, because all the debt peons would get to go home. Now, so biblical jubilees are the same thing. In the Middle Ages, there were anti-usury laws. There always has to be something. Now, what happens this time? We go to a period of virtual money. The first thing they do is they set up the IMF. Institutions like the S&P, the various overarching institutions which, rather than to protect debtors, act to protect creditors. In other words, on these by historical terms, they're doing things precisely backwards. What's the result? Well, the result is predictable. We've had nothing but one series of debt crises after another since the 1970s. The moment that the global south throws off the shackles of debt, which they very successfully did for the most part in the period we now talk of as the alter globalization movement, it rebounds back on Europe again. But there's always a debt crisis somewhere. So one thing that I think that history shows us is that we've got things backwards. It's not going to work. We've produced the very form of debt crisis, which was the sort of great fear of almost all intelligent people through almost all of recorded human history, the social breakdown that comes with untrammeled debt. However, it's also true that if we are talking about 500-year cycles, well, 30 years is not a lot of time. And we've come to the breaking point. I think we found out in 2008 just how much of this, the way they have approached this does not work. I think elites, in order to create any kind of viable system, will be forced to radically reconsider what they're doing. The question is, can we drive that in a democratic direction?
So the mother was free of debt. Who is the mother? Economists think that credits, loans, and as a consequence debts are a consequence of money. So first money came, and then credits and loans and debt came. And you show that it's all the other way around.
Indeed.
And how, in your vision, can the economists be so wrong?
Well, economists seem to make an art of being dramatically wrong about important questions. And the fascinating thing is it doesn't make any difference. Almost in America, I remember reading for years, there was 2 or 3 economists, there was Wallerstein, there was people like Dean Baker, were saying there's an enormous housing bubble. It's going to crash, it's going to be a disaster, and everyone treated them like they were insane. And then there was an enormous crash. And now, 3 years later, they're still treated like they're insane. All the people who are wrong still get on television. So it does. The one thing you learn about economists is it has nothing to do with being right. Being right is not an advantage when you're an economist. I'm an anthropologist. And as an anthropologist, we talk about the myth of barter. In a way, it's a pet peeve we have with economists because 200 years ago, Adam Smith wrote a story about the origins of money. He was speculating. He didn't know. But he thought, well, once upon a time, there must have been people who had too much of one thing and wanted another. And, here's 2 American Indians, and one says to the other, I'll give you 25 arrowheads for that beaver pelt. Maybe 30, okay? 2 beaver pelts. So they negotiate, and this is how the economics worked. I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow, so forth. Eventually this became inconvenient. They had to invent money. Credit systems emerged later after that. It was a kind of evolutionary chain. You go from barter to money to credit to securitized derivatives. It's kind of the same thing. The problem is, for 200 years, anthropologists have been looking for any place where people say, I'll give you 25 arrowheads for that beaver pelt. It doesn't happen, ever. Which is surprising, because there's really not many things that nobody ever does. But this is one. Yet, for some reason, the economists won't change the story, now that they know it's false. It obviously is doing some kind of ideological work for them. And I think what that work is, first of all, it's creating the possibility of economics itself. The reason, if you think about the story, it's absurd. The reason it's absurd is because it assumes that a group of Neolithic villagers are going to be operating entirely on what economists call the spot trade. I'll give you this, you give me that, we walk away. They'll never use credit. Well, why not? They're neighbors. If I want your cow and you don't want my chickens, well, I'm going to have something you want eventually. We're neighbors, and it's nice to have neighbors in your debt. In fact, what happens is when you look at communities that don't use money, is everybody owes something to everybody else. People keep track, and if somebody gives you something back that isn't worth much, you might make fun of them, but you're unlikely to come up with a mathematical formula for exactly how cheap you thought they were. The question becomes, Well, money, how does that happen? Money means being able to say exactly how many chickens equals one cow. In fact, the answer is it happens when people are very angry. If, say, you are mocking me as a cheapskate, people start pulling out weapons and somebody's ear gets cut off, well, then there's very, very specific numbers for how many chickens you should pay. In fact, if you look at law codes of stateless societies, they don't have markets, but they do have very, very complex systems of fines and penalties. So it's in a situation where violence may ensue that people become exact. And it will say, if you cut off someone's ear, that's 20 young cows. And if you don't have cows, well, then you do have to figure out what to substitute, and nobody is in a mood to compromise. So it's exactly those situations of potential violence that people become exact and that money emerges. And that connection between money and violence holds true throughout human history. Over and over again. Systems of currency, for example, emerge to pay soldiers. This idea that we have that, here is the market and here is the state, and the state has to do with war and violence, and money has to do with this zone of human freedom, is completely untrue. Currency is invented and it's tied to tax systems, and it's invented as a way of provisioning troops. This happens over and over and over again in human history. I think it's significant here what's happening in Frankfurt right now. We can sort of see the functions of the state stripped bare, because what's happened when we came here is they seem to have decided to cancel all of the non-coercive functions of the state. Only the violent functions of the state are being maintained. Schools have been shut down. Weddings have been shut down. All of the benevolent functions of the state have been shut down. What are the two functions that are still going? The police and the banks.
Keyword. Talking about violence, if we observe violence, we have to know who is guilty. And this may change. You describe very clearly that debt can be both, on the one hand, a social and moral relationship, and on the other hand, a legal and economic relationship. And in history it has changed if we deem guilty the debtors or the creditors.
Or both.
Or both. At present, we have debtors that are not deemed guilty. The American Insurance Group received billions and billions of taxpayers' money that could go to the universities. And the Deutsche Bank, who is not becoming, who is repeating and repeating that we did not receive taxpayers' money, they received $12 billion of US taxpayers' money. This is a clear matter of fact. And so the Deutsche Bank is a creditor that for being indebted, it's a debtor that for the fact of being indebted is not put into prison, but it is rescued by all of us. So how do you see the relationship between debt and guilt, and why does it change from time to time?
Well, the fascinating thing is how it varies by social class. Even when there were debtors' prisons in 17th century England, one of the reasons that they became so scandalous is because they always had two branches. One was for ordinary debtors who were not fed and often starved to death, and the others were wealthy debtors, for whom being in debtors' prison was often something of a fashion statement. Wealthy debtors were allowed to bring in their own chefs and could receive regular visits from prostitutes, for example, whereas the poor debtors who were deemed to be terribly guilty were allowed to starve, unless, of course, they became servants to the rich ones. That double standard has always existed. And one thing which fascinates me about the history of debt is that a debt is simply a promise. It's all it is. Now, in a way, a promise is a very beautiful and sacred thing. The essence of human freedom is the ability to make promises. The word free in English goes back to the same root as the word for friend, because slaves cannot make promises and make friends. Only free people can make commitments to one another. But a debt is a very peculiar type of promise because it's, as I put it, a promise that has been corrupted by a combination of math and violence. So it becomes something impersonal and something transferable. However, when you are dealing with social equals, it's really just a promise. One finds that among poor people when they lend each other money. When I lend money to my brother, perhaps, it's partly, I might want to give it to him and I just want him not to be embarrassed. Rich people, in turn, when they have debts with one another, they can be amazingly generous, amazingly forgiving when dealing with other rich people. It's just when dealing with you that debt becomes a sacred obligation. So why is a debt between people of unequal power so different? And what I discovered is that, the conclusion I finally came to, is that debt is the most effective ideological means ever invented to take a relation of arbitrary violence, of simple violent domination of one group over another, and turn it not only into a moral relation, but a moral relation in which it seems it's the victim who is at fault. It makes sense. Mafiosi understand this, of course. So do heads of conquering armies. You come in, you say, well, you owe me your life, because I did not kill you. I could have. So I expect payment. But I'm a nice person. I will let you off the hook for the first 3 months. After that, if you have a real problem, you can come to me, but I do expect payment. Suddenly you become the benevolent party, and the victims are running around feeling ashamed of themselves. The problem is it tends to explode. And this is the reason why, it seems, the great classicist, Moses Finley, once said, there's only one revolutionary program in the ancient world: abolish the debts, redistribute the land. Almost every major insurrection or revolt in world history has been about debt, and it's partly because when it blows up, that relationship of violence justified through debt, it does so in a big way, because people start saying, well, wait, who owes what to who here? But there's a trick. And that trick is that the moment you start saying who owes what to who, you are accepting that debt and morality are the same thing. So suddenly the language of debt becomes the language of morality. You see this in all the great world religions. They start by saying debt, sin, guilt, they're all the same. But then they say, well, no, they're not. But they have to start that way. In the Hindu text, they say, well, your life is a debt you owe to the gods. All morality is debt. And they say, but really the only way you can repay that debt is to realize the debt does not exist because you are one with the thing you owe the money to. In the Bible, they start by saying sin and debt are the same. And then they say, but really what is sacred isn't paying debts, but forgiving them. So invariably they're trapped with this language of debt because both sides are using it, the powerful and the powerless. But then they try to move away from it again.
And this relationship becomes so violent, if it becomes legal, it can become a weapon, like John Perkins would say, the economic hitman.
Weaponized debt, yes.
Weaponized debt. But already the word and the acceptance of this relationship. So one instrument to disarm the debts would be a jubilee. I looked for proposals. What is the solution? One solution could be a jubilee. And if we think that only anarchists, or only attackists, or only occupiers request a jubilee, I have a surprise for you. Do you know the Boston Consulting Group?
I do. Jeffrey Sachs, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. The Boston Consulting Group also discovered history, and they published a 13-page study back to Mesopotamia. And they argue that we should make a jubilee, like in Mesopotamia, because there is a very close relationship between debts and assets. So if debts become too high, everything breaks down. And we are now very front to the breakdown of the state, of the enterprises and the households. This is what the Boston Consulting Group says and analyzes. And that's why they say, if we want to bring down the debt, we also have to bring down the assets. And they propose to bring down the debts from the state, from the enterprises and from the households to a maximum of 60% of the GDP of all three sectors they propose. And we should do it with a property on tax, with a tax on property, with a property tax of 27% on the financial property in the United States, and even 34% of the financial property in the Eurozone. That's what the Boston Consulting Group says. Gives this. How can you explain that someone who we would never suppose that they would make this request comes to the same position and ask for jubilee?
Excuse me, you should explain what a jubilee is. I don't even know.
Jubilee is a debt cancellation. It's a clean slate.
Schuldenerlass.
Well, I think one thing that has become very clear over the last year is that the financial elites, the people running the system, are extremely frightened. They know some things that we don't know. Sometimes they tell. I had a recent visit to the Federal Reserve, and they said 2 to 3 years they're expecting the American economy to collapse unless there's debt forgiveness. So they put out a white paper. This is public, actually, some of this. They put out a white paper calling for mass debt forgiveness in America. So something big is going to have to happen. The system that exists doesn't work. They brought themselves to the problem is that for the last 30 or 40 years, the people running the system have been trying to convince everyone that nothing large can be done anymore. Nothing can really change. They've boxed themselves into a hole. They've managed to, I think there's been a kind of a war on the human imagination. And it's affected even the leaders themselves. They can't think big either. They've begun to be affected by their own combination of ideology and the creation of pervasive insecurity, which prevents people from using their imaginations. And the result is that they see the system they've built crumbling around them, but the only thing that they've managed to do is convince everybody, including perhaps themselves, that it's the only possible system that could exist. Well, what do you do when you're in this situation? I think finally they're starting to scramble and realize that some sort of really large gesture is going to be necessary. The Boston Consulting Group, I know that the conclusion that they came to was that if we had a jubilee, if we had mass debt forgiveness, it would be terribly disruptive of society, but not doing so would be even more so. Yes. There's going to be mass disruption one way or another. So I find myself in the uncomfortable position of being talked to by some of the people running the system, the few people running the system who actually are interested in the long-term preservation of the system. Of course, I'm not interested in the long-term preservation of the system at all. But the fact that they're talking to us, I mean, you know, it tells you something.
If you're not interested in long-term preservation of the system, what is your opinion about another reinvocation of some groups who say that the European Central Bank should give interest-free loans to state directly? Germany pays at the present about 60 billion euros of interests for the public debt. If Germany could get the same amount of credits and loans directly from the central bank, 60 billion euros would be free for other state expenses, wars or universities. So what's your opinion about this proposal?
Well, I mean, that's essentially what's happening in America right now. Something very close to that. However, it's true, the Federal Reserve could quite easily eliminate much of the U.S. debt if they wanted to. But the way that the system is set up, the U.S. government has to be in debt in order for there to be money. That's the key to the money supply. So if they went to a system like that, they would have to change a system that's really existed since the Bank of England was created in the 1690s. We have to understand that the creation of central banks has been always closely related to the waging of war. And this is something that, an aspect of capitalism that Marx did not really discuss. In fell outside of his purview. But as a result, radical theorists have tended to neglect that key relation. Remember I was saying that the relation of origins of money lie in violence, but the forms of money creation we have now have remained so. The Bank of England was created from a war loan, 1.2 million pounds that was loaned to King William to fight a war in France, and in exchange for that, he gave the merchants who gave him the loan the right to call themselves the Bank of England, and to then lend the money that he now owed to them in the form of banknotes. I have some British banknotes in my pocket. They still say that. They have a picture of the Queen, and it says, "I promise to pay the bearer the sum of 10 pounds." So a banknote is not 10 pounds. It's a promise from the Queen to give you 10 pounds, which of course you can cancel off against what you owe to her in the form of taxes. That's what money is. It's a promissory note. It's an IOU. But it's based on a war debt. Of course, in this case, that can never be paid, because if the Queen did pay the debt, there would be no money. In a similar way, the US Federal Reserve, there's more smoke and mirrors, but it's really the same system. It's all based on military spending. The deficit in the US, if you look at the real figures, is entirely a military deficit. And it works the same way at home and abroad. It's paid for overseas by people who buy treasury bonds, who are for the most part under US military protection. During the Cold War, it was Germany. West Germany was the primary buyer of US Treasury bonds, which essentially funded the US Army that was sitting here. Japan is doing the same thing, Taiwan, Korea. So it's a military system. We would have to start thinking very hard about what it would mean to create a money system that was not ultimately based on military spending and tied very closely to war.
So obviously there is a lack of confidence in the state. In your book,
My part.
yeah, I want to take this issue. In your book, Inside Occupy, you write literally that anarchism means to bring democratic principles to their logical end. Which is it?
Yes, when I think of anarchism, what I mean by anarchism is the gradual creation of institutions that could exist in a free society. And a free society is one which is not based on systematic threat of violence. I don't believe anarchism is anti-organizational. I think it believes in any form of organization which would not require the ability to call in people with guns or sticks to say shut up and do what you're told at any point. If you could have an organization which would never need those people, there you have it, an anarchist form of organization. I came to the conclusion in the book that whereas there's a great tradition of grassroots democracy in America, which does not emerge from the people who wrote the Constitution. In fact, the people who wrote the Constitution, when I like to annoy Americans, I point out that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution of the United States does it say anything about America being a democracy. The people who wrote those documents were strongly opposed to democracy and said so repeatedly. They felt that democracy meant the kind of thing we're doing here. They didn't like it. They thought it was terribly threatening. In fact, John Adams said outright, we can't have majority vote. If we had majority rule, the first thing they would do, they would abolish the debts and redistribute the land. He said that. So they set up a system which is modeled on Rome, not on Athens. They called it, that's why we have a Senate in America. It was meant to have limited democratic elements, but mainly to suppress the dangers of democracy. Sometime in the 1830s, they got the clever idea of calling it democracy. Mainly because people kept voting for people who called themselves Democrats. And the same thing happened in France and eventually around the world. But the system of government that exists in the US was a system designed to suppress democracy. However, there is nonetheless a tradition of grassroots democracy which has continued to exist and to inspire people. Nothing frightens the people running the United States more than the danger of democracy breaking out. It's true. I've observed it time and time again. Every time there is a grassroots democratic movement. It happened in the 1950s with the civil rights movement. It happened in the 70s with the anti-nuclear movement, a movement based on civil disobedience, direct democracy, direct action. The people running America panic. They make and it happened with the global justice movement. The same thing happens. They make concessions to divide the liberals from the radicals, and then they start a war. Vietnam War after the Civil Rights Movement, the proxy wars in Latin America after the anti-nuclear movement, in the, of course, the war on terror. In each case, the direct democracy starts turning into an anti-war movement, which is always more hierarchically organized. I think one of the most positive things about the current situation is it's very hard to see how the American government can do that again. You know, they're terrified by the threat of democracy breaking out. They've suppressed it quite violently. They've managed to split the liberals from the radicals, but they can't start a war. They really can't invade Iran. They've thought about it and obviously given up on the idea. So in a way, I think this is a unique historical opportunity to see how we can take that grassroots democratic tradition, which I do believe, if driven to its logical endpoint, could only produce a system without an anarchic system without centralized bureaucratic forms of violence, if only because democracy itself will only be fully possible under a free society.
Do you know the method of decision making that is called systemic consensing?
I don't know.
Systematic consensing?
Well, we use the consensus process. Well, we call it consensus process, yeah. I don't know if people know the history of consensus process. I don't know what people use here. For us in America, this is, I think, one of the great achievements of the movement. And it's often thought of as anarchist process, but for the reason that it's been very enthusiastically adopted by most anarchists in America, because we see it as a form of decision-making that could exist in a genuinely free society. But it really comes more out of feminism. It comes out of a combination of feminism, anarchism, and even some spiritual traditions. And what it is it's very different than voting. People assume that what consensus is a unanimous vote, but it's not. What it is a process whereby people make proposals, and that proposal is transformed. Everyone gets to weigh in. Everyone who has an objection or problem with the proposal gets to express it. And gradually you change the proposal until you find something that most people think is a great idea and nobody is violently opposed to. So we have a system of what we call stand-asides and blocks. I don't know if people use this here.
Yeah.
Oh, you already know this stuff. I'm okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Comes from feminism and also from indigenous people.
And Quakers.
And Quakers.
Yeah.
So there seems to be something valuable because it comes from different sources. And indigenous people say after talking and talking and talking 2, 3, 4 hours, without taking a decision, everyone stood up and everyone knew what was to do. So democracy is obviously just a mask, a disguise for something that is not real democracy. That is what also Konstantin Becker has remarked. You were saying that actually we are all anarchists. And capitalism is just the worst method to organize communism, because there is only communism possible. Well,
At a certain level, at a certain task. Yeah.
What do you mean?
Okay. One of the very first anarchist pamphlet I wrote was called, "Are You an Anarchist? The Answer May Surprise You." I think a lot of people are already anarchists, they just don't know it. Or they behave like anarchists most of the time. I had a realization at a certain point that the same is partly true of communism, in the sense of we're used to thinking of communism either as a system of state control or as a system of property rights. But originally, the idea was from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. Well, whenever you're engaged in a cooperative project, that's how you behave. If I'm working for a large corporation and I'm fixing a pipe, and I say, hand me the wrench, the other person doesn't say, yeah, what do I get? You allocate resources by abilities and needs because it's efficient. It's the only thing that works. And it's very ironic because we have this very commonsensical notion that, well, communism has been shown not to work. In fact, corporations use communist means all the time because it's the only thing that works. If you look at natural disasters, hierarchies, exchange systems become luxuries you can't afford. You kind of revert to a kind of communism of abilities and needs. And on some level too, some sort of minimal communism is the basis of all human social relations, in the sense that if the need is great enough, and if the cost is small enough, of course everyone assumes we will behave communistically. The need great enough being, I'm drowning, a house is on fire. Well, yes, of course, those who can help will. If the cost is small enough, you have directions, you have a light. And of course, in many societies, that's expanded from such small things to food. In many societies, it's completely impossible to refuse a request for food. There's a famous story that I always like to tell from New Zealand, a Maori story, about this famous glutton who used to walk along the beach, and whenever people would come home from fishing, he would say, octopus, I love octopus, and they'd have to give him the octopus, or the squid, that's my favorite, and people would constantly be giving him all the best catch, until about 3 years later, people got so sick of it, they formed a war party and killed him. Because it's actually easier to kill someone than to say, no, I will not give you the fish. So often requests, like that, you can't refuse. So there's always a minimal basis of communism on which any social relation is built. Even capitalist social relations, even relations of exchange, relations of hierarchy, are built on an elementary communism. It's the foundation of all human sociality. So this is why I say capitalism is a bad way of organizing communism. Doesn't mean we can ever get to the point where all social relations will be based on that kind of communism. Some forms of exchange will no doubt always exist. Some forms of hierarchy will exist. I mean, I always say we're all communists with our best friends. We're all feudal lords when dealing with small children. But nonetheless, the question is how these things are integrated and what's the dominant principle. And what we see is the real basis of human nature.
I just met Joachim Bauer. He's a neurobiologist at a railway station in Mannheim, and he found out that people also prefer to die than to not share community. Even if they have food, obviously humans prefer to die than not being in community.
Yeah, I mean, and pleasure. I mean, what we forget is that most forms of pleasure are shared. I mean, who would want to go to a wonderful French restaurant and eat a meal all by yourself? I mean, people do it occasionally. It's kind of miserable. Almost all pleasures are pleasurable because they are shared with others. And we should think about it as a sort of communism of the senses, which is the basis of most of the things we think is fun. Communism pervades almost all the positive aspects of our lives already.
In a second, we pass over to the open discussion, but the very last question is very important for me. You're talking about freedom and a free society instead of after capitalism. Could you tell us about your definition of freedom?
Well, I think, in a way I already have. It's one where there are no institutional structures of coercion or structural violence. But I like to think about promises. I love that idea that the word free comes from the same root as friend. A free person is a person who can choose who they want to make promises to, who they want to make commitments to. It doesn't mean living free of commitments. It means the ability to form new ones in a voluntary way. And I think that one thing we haven't really thought about leads directly from money. Monies are sort of promises perverted by math and violence into something that's gone crazy and turned us all into slaves. Yet what form of promises would free men and women make to one another? What would be the kinds of promises we would make in a free society? I think that's where we need to start thinking, when we need to reinvent ourselves and reinvent the idea of what our relations to each other could be.
Just spontaneously, do you know the Latin meaning of communism? I read that Geneviève Vaughan, Gift Economy, she wrote that it comes from com and munus, you know, and munus is the gift. So communism is as a relationship or a society of mutual gift giving in Latin. In Latin. Who wants to say or ask David something? Maybe just first you raise your hands and I see how many they are, and then we can see how we proceed. There is 1, 2, 3, 4.
I'd say something to that. When you talk about common gifts and turning into money, well, the thing that most brought that home to me is the idea of the symbolon. The word symbol in English, I don't know what the word is in German, same word. It goes back to a Greek word, which means something you break in half. And when people would eat at each other's houses, they would take some object, they would break it in half, and they would say, all right, we will always be friends. If you are ever in need, I will help you, and so forth. So if you ever had a problem, you would come to them with your half of this little cup or ring or disc and put it back together again. Then they started putting notches on them. And when they did that, they became tally sticks, which became money. So money emerges out of the quantification of a promise. In fact, the greatest form of money in the Middle Ages were tally sticks, sticks that were broken in half exactly like that. So there you can see in a perfect example of how you take a relation of love and turn it into numbers. It becomes something impersonal that you can pass to someone else. The same thing happened in China. And the word, both European languages and in Chinese, the word for symbol is originally the word for promissory or tally notes.
Okay, so let's see. There were 4 persons who want to say something. We see if we gather the statements, maybe just start as loud as you can.
We are used to analyzing the accumulation of debt and the concentration of wealth as a capitalist problem. You are saying it's not only a capitalist problem, it happens across history. So how do you explain this innate tendency, obviously, of, are you saying all societies, to this concentration of debt and land and wealth? Is there an explanation you have for it? Does it have to happen every time in a society?
Prefer to answer directly.
Well, I think it depends on what kind of society. I'm talking about societies that are already based on a fundamental inequality. If a society is divided into classes and they are using a form of impersonal money, it's almost inevitable that those with the resources to create money will use that to enslave, further enslave those over whom they have power, and use the ideology of debt to lock in that power. So I don't think that it's a matter of there's some primordial fault in human beings that we will somehow always generate that. In fact, throughout history, you find people who refuse to behave that way. Societies based on absolutely avoiding that kind of logic. And that will take many forms, anything from extremely egalitarian societies to the society in the great epics, which are not equal at all, but they're refusing to use money, and everything becomes a contest and a game as a way of ensuring that kind of accumulation of debt never takes place. So I think what we're looking at is a kind of one of many potentials in human society that becomes realized under certain circumstances.
As a veteran of the global justice protest in Seattle and your contributing thoughts to the Occupy movement, I was wondering if you could give us some practical suggestions to make the most of this strange situation in Frankfurt tonight.
Ah, yes. Well, in my own experience, what I'm seeing in Frankfurt most resembles the IMF meetings of, I think it was 2002, the first IMF meetings after 9/11. We weren't sure we should even do it because the situation was so in favor of the police or the national mood, but we felt we had to. 2,000, 3,000 anarchists, maybe 4, showed up. Yeah, it seemed to have more in Frankfurt, but and we were immediately surrounded by 20 or 30,000 police who were very aggressive. In fact, at one point, they surrounded us next to the IMF building, the World Bank building, which is completely made of glass. And usually they didn't allow us anywhere near it. And they kept us there for 2 hours, waiting for us to throw a brick. Of course, we didn't. And it was very demoralizing because we were so outnumbered. And they'd mobilized every conceivable resource. They had the army, they had tanks, they had police. And we left feeling terrible. But, and this is what really shocked me, I happened to know someone who had a friend who was going to the IMF meetings. And he said it was horrible. They didn't really have the IMF meetings. They shut down everything. The police had cordon after cordon you had to go through. All of the parties were canceled. All of the ceremonial events were canceled. Most people didn't even come. Basically, they didn't have IMF meetings. And I thought about that, and I thought, that's amazing. Because what that shows you is that whoever is running global capitalism is terrified of us. I mean, we're like 3,000 pathetic anarchists, you know? We didn't do anything. And like, they would rather we go home feeling miserable than that the IMF meets. Think about that for a moment. I mean, we're very important to them. So I think that they were having a similar situation here. I think for the last 30 years, the top priority of the people running the global capitalist system is that meetings like this never happen. They were so frightened by what happened in the 60s that they've constructed layer on layer of preemption against any possibility that people involved in social movements should feel that they are accomplishing anything. After that IMF meeting, for example, I started looking around and thinking, and I realized, well, the same is true of the war, isn't it? The people running the war in Iraq and Afghanistan are obsessed with preventing an effective anti-war movement. They talk about it. They say we must overcome the Vietnam syndrome. But what they mean is we have to prevent any effective opposition, both at home and within the military, to military adventures, and that's much more important to them than whether they win the war. In fact, they've created terms of engagement which guarantee they aren't going to win the war. They have this calculus, how many dead bodies to how many protesters. So they make sure that there are very few dead bodies by creating terms of engagement which ensure they massacre civilians regularly to make sure that no soldiers die, or very, very few. As a result, everybody hates them. They're never going to win the war. Opposition grows, but they don't care. It's more important to them that anti-war movement is not effective than that they win. So I think if you look at global capitalism as a whole, I think it's the same thing. I think that neoliberalism is a gigantic system for depoliticization and preventing social movements. If you look at it step by step, suddenly everything makes sense. Precarious labor, that's a great example. Or the fact that they keep wanting people to work more and more, even though it's not economically viable. I mean, you don't get better laborers if you have them frightened and overworked. In fact, the effectiveness economically is terrible. However, it's brilliant in depoliticizing labor and breaking the power of unions and preventing people from having the time to engage in political activity, making them too scared to be able to contemplate it. Over and over again, they've created this situation where the only battle they've won is the ideological battle. The system, and as a result, they're destroying capitalism. They're not, in the same way that they're like willing to lose the war to prevent an anti-war movement, they're destroying capitalism to try to preempt any possibility of an anti-capitalist movement. But it is being destroyed. It's crumbling around us. So I think that what we see here in Frankfurt is this incredible overkill where they're willing to shut down the government functions and bring in thousands and thousands of police. Shows just how seriously, just how frightened they are of us. And we need to remember that at every moment.
And it's repeating. The World Trade Organization hides in Doha and in Singapore, and the fences become even more expensive, and this is the first preemptive fortress, maybe. Another one.
Yeah, we're talking about Jubilee as a means of solving the current situation. I've been shouting all day, so...
Understood.
But it seems to me that all I would do is reset same manner. I mean, isn't it time that we think the next step, what comes beyond what we have been repeating for the last 5,000 years, and what would that be?
Well, remember that capitalism has not existed for 5,000 years. I think so. Capitalism is just this one cycle, and I rather think that the end result of the movement away from capitalism, which I believe a jubilee would speed along, will be to come up with something else. I am deeply concerned that the next thing they come up with will be even worse. I think all the more reason to work on imagining something better. But a jubilee isn't an answer to the problem. So jubilee is to me, it's a conceptual reset. It's a way of beginning to think again. Because we've boxed ourselves into a conceptual hole. I mean, partly because of this ideological offensive against the imagination. But as a result of that, you know, so many things are taken for granted that we lose the sense of these things are human creations, that we can do otherwise. So I don't think of Jubilee as a solution. I think of it as a first step to open up our sense of possibilities. Once we realize that money is just this thing that we make.
Yes, but wouldn't a jubilee, you know, if a Boston consulting group is sort of proposing it now, it seems that the rich and powerful are discovering it as a tool to perpetuate the system.
They're desperate for something. If they're looking at that, you know they're in trouble. And sure, they're going to try desperate measures, and desperate measures don't always work the way they're intended to work. Obviously, I find myself in the funny situation where members of the ruling class are coming to me saying, help us save capitalism. Well, I don't want to save capitalism. On the other hand, I think if I thought that a jubilee would really save capitalism, I wouldn't be suggesting it.
There was one.
Coming here, I talked with people about like the Occupy, and they were just not concerned at all.
Who?
Like,
What people?
Everybody.
Passers-by.
Yeah, passers-by, and like they were just not concerned. Like, I would like to ask you, what will be for you the best solution to raise people awareness on this problem?
Well, I think that the media is never going to do it for us. I think that in Occupy, we had a brief moment of about 2 months where the media was actually covering what we did. And most of the people like me who had been doing this for 10, 12 years, we couldn't understand what was happening. It's like, wait, we say something, we do an interview and they print what we say. That's never happened before. They're actually covering it when the police attack us. That's crazy. It was a small window. And it turned out to be from a very particular political conjunction whereby a lot of liberal groups thought they could take over the movement, and then when they realized they couldn't, suddenly the media disappeared. However, I think that you can't prove to people that a different way of doing things is possible. You can't convince them through a logical argument. You can only show them. But nothing is more powerful than bringing people to a place where they see these things happen. I mean, it worked on me. I didn't know. I actually wasn't at Seattle. I was walked out of my class one day where I was teaching. I saw a headline, martial law declared in Seattle. What? Because of course they hadn't been covering it, so it was a great surprise to all of us in America. And I said, "Oh, this is great. Where do I join?" And I walked in, and I discovered these people sitting there in meetings of thousands of people coming to decisions without a leadership structure, and I was astounded. I mean, I always considered myself an anarchist on paper, but even I had never imagined that would be possible. So I think the more that we create institutions that actually begin to affect people's everyday lives, intervene in real, genuine, practical problems. That's what we're doing in Occupy. We've lost a lot of the media attention, and we've lost a lot of the money, which is great, because the money was destroying us. It's another story. What we have done is we've started to create thousands of local campaigns, well, maybe not hundreds, yes, across America. Occupy homes, occupy farms. We have like upwards of a dozen Occupy farms in New York alone. The farms that had been foreclosed. So we're gradually, we have to be the thing that's there when things fall apart, because things are starting to fall apart. We have to be the people with the organizational skills that can start picking things up. And we can start doing that now. It will start on a small scale. But nothing threatens the powers that be more than the threat of a good example. Simply showing that things are possible, that people did not believe to be possible, immediately changes people's horizons of possibility. In their political sense, yeah.
Loud, take all your voice.
So, wann kommt sie in München nächsten Montag? Ich meine, nächsten Monat ist es eine Welthaus, DGB.
Okay, wir sagen dann alle Daten am Ende noch einmal durch. Der Veranstalter, the next presentations of the book, maybe we say it at the end again, of the Klett-Cotta Verlag. There is another statement.
Yeah, back to the Jubilee.
Okay.
Yes, it's a certainly very appealing idea. But you said that it is not was probably working in favor of the steering personnel of capitalism. And I think we should just start we should just start with our own Jubilee.
Absolutely, yes. Death strike.
Just no longer continuing paying interest, for instance, and paying taxes, for instance. For a state who is just doing only one job, just trying to save this system we do not want. What do you think about this?
I totally agree with you that I don't want to ask the lords running the system for favors.
Repeat the question.
The question was, why were we talking about a jubilee? We should take matters into our own hands. We should have a debt strike. We should not refuse to pay taxes, refuse to pay interest. To which my response is, that is of course the ideal. I don't particularly want to ask the people running the world for favors. I mean, if they want to do a favor, I can give them an idea of what, but I'm not going to demand it. I'm not going to base my politics on appealing to authorities that I do not consider to be legitimate. The ideal is always to do it yourself. The problem is it's proved historically rather difficult to organize debtors. It's been done in a few places, and but the question is, because debt tends to isolate and humiliate people. People feel guilty. It's very difficult to get massive numbers of people to overcome that. We're working on it. We're trying. In New York, for example, we have a Occupy student debt campaign. And one thing we've done there is to have a pledge. Because nobody wants to default on their own, because if you default on a student debt, you can get up $10,000 in penalties sometimes. They have crazy laws now, punitive laws. However, what we've done is we've created a pledge where people all agree pardon me, where people all agree that once we have, say, 50,000 names on this pledge, then everyone stops simultaneously. That seems to be the way to go with it.
Very good idea.
Yeah.
It's happening in Greece already.
Are they?
Yes.
It's happening
They're doing a lot of things. We're probably going to be doing it in 3 or 4 years.
in Greece.
Yeah.
We take the last. We take the last questions. There is 1, 2, 3. We take them together because it's already the end. And is there another question which I did not see? No, there isn't. So it's 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3 over the third one. And then the final word to David, and a very last question comes from my side.
Okay.
We start.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. The first is, First, let me say for you not to understand me wrong, thank you, you do a good job, and I hope you sell a lot of your books. But my question is, the profit that you make with your books, especially with this new book, Inside Occupy, is this just for your personal, private use, or do you donate some of your profits to the movement, parts of it?
Next question.
And the second question is, if it is possible to get one of each of your books as a donation for the Library of Occupy Berlin.
Oh, I should hope so. Well, the money from the books, well, I shouldn't say this in the presence of my publishers, but my experience has been if you want to get ebooks of these things for free, there's always a way. I don't know what way that is, and I certainly wouldn't suggest anyone do that, something illegal, you know. But you know, yes, I have a tendency to fund a lot of projects with the profits of this stuff. We'll see what. But, of course. And my habit has, in English at least, I sort of alternated. I have some books which I release for money since I do need to live. And I have other ones which are free. Like the Revolutions in Reverse book we just released for nothing. Well, I mean, you can buy it paper for cost, and then we have a PDF which anybody can download. So I don't know what arrangements we have here. It's just, you know, somebody else who did it all, actually. But no doubt there are interesting things going on with it. As for copies for the occupation, I should hope, and I would be happy if it costs anything to, like, please take it out of my royalties to dedicate copies of this to all of the libraries of all the various occupies. Please do.
There was one question, the second last, and the last was there. Please.
You're part of the protest? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. You imagine I'm part of a protest.
You're part of a protest, you try to do something against capitalism movement, and you realize that your partners, they are all somehow invested themselves in capitalism, capitalist ideas, but they don't know. How do you make sure to help them to get these ideas out of their minds and to make sure that you and them live in the same reality?
I actually think that, again, this is one of those cases where you can't prove something to people, you have to show them. You know, you can argue with a libertarian, you know, or a anarcho-capitalist or someone like that for 100 years. That's what they like to do, is argue. The best thing to do is to create something. When I talk to people who are sort of, you know, there are people in America, not that many as you think, but there who are the sort of free market anarchists or free market libertarian types who claim to be on the same page except they're pro-capitalist. I always say the same thing. I say, well, look, let's get rid of the state and see what happens, you know. You think there'll be a market, I don't. We'll see who's right. And I'm pretty confident that this is not a problem because, all right, the way I always put it to them, imagine there's an island and it's divided in half, and half of them are a bunch of anarcho-capitalists. They create a society where nobody gets anything unless they, you know, form a contract, and there's no social guarantees. Some people have property, some don't. Then the other ones form a left anarchist collective where everybody's guaranteed their basic needs. So for what possible reason would the guys who don't have property on one side of the island want to stay there? Everybody always says, well, you know, you're going to need to have coercion to stop me from hiring people to pick my strawberries. Nobody ever says you're going to need coercion to stop me from hiring myself out to pick somebody else's strawberries, because nobody actually wants to do that if they have any choice. So I really don't think these things are going to be a problem once we start actually building alternative institutions.
The last question was you? Last one.
I'm interested in this idea that the Iraq War and the Vietnam War and were responding to these democratic social movements. How do you determine that?
Well, I don't. I mean, how can you tell what the reality of what people were thinking actually is? And every historical event is overdetermined. There's always a million reasons. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. Every time you do have an outbreak of democratic social movements, you do see the same pattern. They make surprisingly rapid concessions, and somehow a war gets started, and it's a voluntary war, you know? It's not a war that's forced on them. So it could be a coincidence, but 3 times in a row seems a bit much, you know?
My very last question to David is, you're also writing about love?
Yes, they do.
What?
Love. Liebe. Yeah. Yeah, I understand love is indivisible, or it's an attitude you live in every situation. Also when the police is not polite to you. So maybe, as we still will meet the police, can you give a last advice to the occupiers?
Concerning the police?
How, yeah, with their inner attitude. Just your experience, your whatever you want to say.
Well, you know, police are like anyone else. They're all different. Some of them are horrible as individuals. Most are not. But I think that the thing that we need to remember about the police and the forces of repression is that, and this is what I always say to sort of insurrectionary anarchists too, is, well, we're never going to militarily defeat the army. You know, we're not going to go to battle against the 101st Airborne Division and win, you know. They're very good at violence. In fact, it's the only thing they're really very good at. They'll always be better than us, and that reflects well on us, I think. Now, I think that, so therefore, when anarchists win, when radical social movements really win, it's because they refuse to shoot us. Ultimately, it will come down to a choice, and those people will be given the choice of either killing us or not killing us. And generally speaking in history, they usually refuse when it comes down to when the stakes are really high, when it's clear that the people are genuinely against them. Now, of course, the other thing is you can't be, if you're too nice to the forces of order, you never get to the point where they have to make that choice. We have to bring them to that choice, but we have to put them in a situation where they will make the choice that is right to make. Historically, that's what happens over and over again. I mean, even the Russian Revolution, there was an entire army that was sent to St. Petersburg and deserted. Even the revolutions that we think are largely violent were largely won by persuading the guys with the guns not to fire them. That's what it's going to come down to in the end.
Very much, David. We close with a short announcement. There was the question with Munich. What date is Munich?
Monday.
Monday. On Monday in Munich, you can look at the Klett Cotta or the campus websites. There's an announcement.